always dangerous for me to be speaking at a golf course. I've been playing since I was 11 years old and still love it just as much. And what a great game at 66 years old and still can play the game. So it's great to be with you. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about living the larger story of your life. But I don't get to speak to just men. Very rarely is it just a men's audience. So I get to share a story that I love sharing with men only. So the question is, I want to ask you a question, and that is, are computers male or female? That's the question this morning. All right, well, if a computer were gender, what would it be, male or female? A focus group among two groups revealed the following insights. One group was female, the other male. Now, the men's group decided that computers should definitely be female because no one but their creator understands their internal logic. The native language they use to communicate with other computers is incomprehensible to everyone else. Even the smallest mistakes are stored in long-term memory for possible later retrieval. As soon as you make a commitment to one, you find yourself spending half your paycheck on accessories for it. All right, here's what the women said. The women's group said computers were masculine because in order to get their attention, you have to turn them on. They have a lot of data, but they're still clueless. They are supposed to have you solve problems, but half the time they are the problem. And as soon as you make a commitment to one, you realize that if you'd waited a little longer, you could have gotten a better model. The women won. Okay, I'm going to do one more question for you this morning, and then if you get the answer right, I'm going to give you the devotional book. So, who was the most successful businessman in the Bible? Just throw out a name. Solomon, no. Jesus, no. No. Keep going. Joseph, no. Job, no. Who's that? David, no. Solomon, no. No. Keep coming. Am I going to have to just give this away? Somebody else. It's a man. Huh? The Melchizedek, no. Who? No. Adam, no. Abraham, no. Oh, geez. All right, it begins with an N. Nehemiah, no. Noah. Who said that? Noah, because his business was the only one that was not liquidated. Trick question. All right. So, if I asked you today, how many of you are living the larger story of your life, how would you answer the question? The larger story of your life. Well, I thought I was living the larger story of my life. I was very satisfied to have my ad agency back in the 90s where I would, teach a Bible study. I was giving money to Christian causes and got to play golf a couple of times a week. I thought that was my larger story. And then one day, something happened to change all of that. And my wife walked in one day and said, Os, I want to separate. I said, you want to separate? We'd had some counseling and had some challenges, but I didn't feel like we were at that point. And then within 3 months, I had a number of things happen. I had an investment on the West Coast and the East Coast of about $500,000, and my advisor called me one day and says, your money's all gone. It's a Bernie Madoff type of situation. Of course, we didn't know him at that time, but that's what it was. It was a scam. And then I had a client that represented 80% of my business, and he says to me, we're firing you, and we're not paying your $140,000 bill. And so that happened. And then my second largest account, my vice president came in and said, I'm leaving. But he didn't tell me he was taking my second largest account with him. And so within a matter of just a few months, life went from one place to a whole another place. And 2 years into that journey, as I was really living a very defeated Christian life, thinking, how does this happen? I met a man named Gunnar Olsson from Sweden, the founder of the International Christian Chamber of Commerce, and he says to me, you have a Joseph calling on your life. I said, what in the world is a Joseph calling? He says, well, it's a marketplace call in which you're a spiritual and physical provider to others, and if you'll press into the Lord will see you through this season. And he became very prophetic that day, and he became my mentor in the marketplace. And so for the next 7 years, God would take me through a process and really remake me and usher me into a new season to what I'm doing now. And literally, what I could have never imagined that a guy that barely got out of English class and was very, very shy growing up would end up writing 18 books and going to 26 countries to equip leaders around the world and write a daily devotional that would go to 100 nations. And so, but that's what he did. In 7 years to the month, God restored my finances. I would ultimately get remarried, and God would really birth me into a whole different life. And so what I've been learning over the last several years is that God is doing a work in marketplace people. And, you know, it was in the 90s when we really began to see an awakening, if you will, of men and women in the marketplace to say that I'm not a second-class citizen. I'm actually called to what I do. That reminds me of the two guys who were business guys got lost on an island, and one says, how are we going to get off this island? And the guy says, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to get off because I make $100,000 a week. And the other guy says, why does that matter? You're on this island. That's not going to do you any good. And so he says, no, you don't understand. I make $100,000 a week, and I give 10% of that at my local church. My pastor's going to find me. And that's how a lot of us feel, isn't it? You know, as marketplace guys, we feel like we're just there to write a check. But really, you have a spiritual calling. God has called you to do what you're doing, to be transformers. And just like Joseph freed an entire nation, and God used him in that way. Well, one of the things I discovered in my book, I discovered that in studying leaders, I found that there were 6 unique stages that God will use in the life of raising up a leader. And you might want to jot this down, or it's in both of my books, it really unpacks this. But the first thing I saw in leaders was there was usually a recruitment strategy through some kind of crisis. Joseph thrown into a pit. David meets Goliath. You look at Martin Luther. He put his thesis on the door. It ushered him into a major call in his life. And so often, the first stage of any larger story can often be a crisis. Like our brother talked about, it led him into a new relationship with God. And so that crisis. Then the second stage I noticed was character development. God often takes us through a season of character development in order for us to really be and live that larger story. You think of Joseph's character development was as a result of those 13 years of preparation for an 81-year assignment. Or how about David? His character development was fleeing Saul's sword. You know, he did his job so well that, Saul wanted to kill him because he was an insecure leader. In fact, going back to that first one, King Saul became king because of a business problem. He lost the donkeys in his father's business, and so he was out trying to find the donkeys, and God used that problem to usher him into being first king of Israel. So then, character development. Now, the third thing is isolation. So often God isolates the leader, and I like to say the purpose of that is to turn messes into messages into messengers. So often God would isolate the leader in order for him to receive a download from God that he would proclaim other places. And we see that consistently. You see Paul in prison where he's writing the epistles, right? He's isolated. He can't do anything but be there. You think of Jeremiah and Isaiah. You think of John Bunyan, who for 12 years was put in prison and he wrote Pilgrim's Progress. You think of Nelson Mandela, 27 years in prison, and he went from the prison to the palace, didn't he? And I wrote the devotional during a time of isolation. And I was writing that devotional really for me, because I was trying to understand my own pain, my own, why did this happen to me? And as I began to write it, I would share it with a few people on my email list. And as I did that, occasionally I'd miss a day, and I'd get this email back from people and say, "Where's my devotional?" I said, "What do you mean, where's your devotional? You're not paying for it." But that was the only idea that I got that it was actually helping anybody. And then when it got, a friend of mine who had a website that later became crosswalk.com said to me, "Hey, this is really good. Why don't you let me put it on our website and we'll send it out for you so you don't have to send it." And so when that happened, I started getting these emails from people around the world saying, "You read my mail today. You spoke right into my situation." And that was the one phrase that I would hear for year after year after year of people and their experience with the devotional. And so I realized that what I went through, a lot of other people were going through. And that's a principle, isn't it? That God takes us through something and then he turns what we overcome or we gain into our authority to minister to other people. It becomes our authority as we gain victory in something. And so character development. And then there was another stage that I noticed, and it was called the cross stage. Now, the cross stage was, I noticed that almost every leader had to pass what I call the graduate level test. And that was, Jesus washed the feet of Judas. And Jesus said, "Now, I want you to bless your enemies, not curse them. Love your enemies." And I had a guy that betrayed me. I had 5 major betrayals in my journey. And one guy was very close to me, and I published his book. And so one day I was thinking, well, golly, now he's spreading all these lies about me. And I said, well, I guess I'm going to stop publishing his book or promoting him. And then the Lord reminded me, he says, what part of that verse did you not get? Love your enemies. Bless your enemies. And so I said, oh, you don't mean that, And so I had to keep publishing him and promoting him. And so the thing about the cross is that we're all called to come to the cross. But in order to do that, even if you're the most passionate follower of Christ, you can only put 2 nails in your own cross. So what God usually does for us is he raises up a third person to come put that nail in to make sure that you're dead. You see, the goal of the Christian life is death, not life. It's death to your old man in order to give life to others, right? That's what the Christian life is all about. And so the cross phase is the graduate level phase. And so you got Joseph, who was betrayed by his brothers. You got David, who was betrayed by his own son. You got Jesus and Judas. And you look in the scriptures and you see a consistent pattern with that. So then the next phase is actually problem solving. Now we're in the phase where we start to see the fruit of our call. And one of the things that Jesus did consistently was he solved a problem. Every time he met a person, he solved the problem. When he met Peter, he solved his fishing problem. He solved his tax problem. He said, go catch the fish and there's going to be a coin in the mouth. He solved the problem for the prostitute who was about to get stoned. He solved the problem of Lazarus' death. Now, the result of all that problem solving was influence. So every time he would solve a problem, his influence would go up. So if you want to know the key to transformation and impacting culture, it's start solving a problem. And every time you solve a problem, your influence is going to go up. And people are going to come to you. And that's, people in culture don't care who solves their problem. They just want their problem solved. And if you solve their problem, you're going to have influence. It becomes a byproduct rather than a goal. And so as I began to learn that, I realized, that's really God, isn't it? And that's what Jesus did. He just looked to see the Father, what he was doing. He operated, and as a result, the people followed him, and he had great influence. The final stage is networking. I realized that God is into networks: Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Jesus and the 12. And Daniel, he had his 3 friends. And networks are important to leveraging in order to do something greater. And I realized that the networks is really key to influence culture. And the thing that you have on your table is about an international summit that we're doing next year in Washington, where we're bringing together networks and bringing together those who operate at the tops of the 7 cultural mountains of business, arts, and entertainment. And Roma Downey is going to be our arts and entertainment speaker. And we're partnering with the Museum of the Bible. So I invite you to come be with us. It's going to be a tremendous time of understanding the signs of the times and how we can influence it. You see, one of the things I discovered was that it takes as little as 2 to 3%, 3 to 5% to actually shift a cultural mountain. And the reason I say that is because we have a great case study of that with the gay rights movement. You see, back in the 80s, there was a book written as a result of 175 gay activists that came together, and they were meeting to strategize on how do we change America's view of this issue from being a moral issue to being a civil issue. And what came out of that was a book called After the Ball. And so what they decided to do was they would develop a strategy to go into these 7 key areas of business, government, arts and entertainment, media, family, education, the church, and they would go into these areas. For instance, in arts and entertainment, they had script writers go to Hollywood and begin writing stories about gays being in movies and showing them as normal people and not showing them as unusual. They would get in sitcoms, and they would write scripts, and they would have actors play roles there. They would go into education, and they would begin to write textbooks about sexuality and begin to get positions on school boards, and they would get in through a strategy. And so in education, in the colleges and so forth. So you see how they have gradually used that to really affect change to the point that we now see that issue no longer from a moral perspective that many of us believers do, but from a civil issue, even to the point that they tried to, get on the, basically adopt the civil rights movement strategy, which made, those leaders very upset. And so that's why I say that we have something like 30% of the population that proclaims to be born again. And so if we simply adopted that strategy, we could have much more effect in the culture, because these 7 areas are what most people define the culture, how they define the culture. And so networks, one of the great networks that I love to talk about is the network of the Clapham Group, William Wilberforce in England, he came to Christ. He was a very wealthy guy, come from wealthy family, and he came to faith in Christ when he was 28 years old. And so he got excited about God, and he says, I must be supposed to be a pastor. And well, he had a mentor in his life, a guy named John Newton. John Newton was a former slave owner who wrote Amazing Grace, the hymn we're all familiar with. And so he comes to him and says, no, you're not going to be a pastor. You're called to you're called to politics. And so as a result of that admonition, he stayed in politics, and after 30 years of work, they were able to abolish slavery, along with 69 other initiatives that were not only changing England, but the world. And so here you had 18 individuals that had a great impact. And so those are the 6 stages. So we have a few minutes, and I'd like to open it up in just a minute if you have any questions. But before I do, I just want to ask each of you a question, and that is, how many of you think you have a poster in hell with your name on it? What I mean by that is, how many of you are a threat to the kingdom of darkness? When you wake up in the morning, do the devils get nervous? Do they say, oh no, Bob's up, we got to go get such and such to take care of him, we got to checkmate him this morning? Or are you no threat? In the book of Acts, there was a situation where this guy was seeing all the activity that the disciples were doing. They were seeing the miracles. And so this guy decided he wanted to do the same thing, but he wasn't a believer. And so he comes up and he starts talking to somebody, and the devil speaks through this person and says, Jesus I know, and the disciples I know, but who are you? That's what the demon said. Because he really didn't have a relationship with God. And so, God has called you and I to express our life in and through the marketplace where the greatest influence is. And that's why a group like this is so, so important. And I affirm you for being a part of it to gain strength from each other. I'm going to take some questions for the last 5 minutes, if you've got any questions, and if not, we'll close out our time. There's a question back there.
How do you see getting the culture back?
How do I see getting culture back? I see it by being problem solvers and by networks. And that's why I haven't done an international conference in 9 years. And so this conference in March of next year is bringing together leaders in these 7 areas who are doing things, who have strategies that we learn from each other, and we network with each other, and we leverage with each other. And so that's how I see it happening. Someone else? Thank you for that one. Yes, sir.
You had mentioned that you remarried, so I'm assuming you divorced.
I did.
So can you talk a little bit about the healing process through that divorce and how that prepared you for your second marriage?
That's a good question. He's asked if I got divorced. I did, and what was the healing process for that? Yeah, it was a very difficult time because from my perspective, I was investing everything I could to save the marriage, but it didn't happen. And so it just took time, and if you go through a divorce, it's going to take time because there's a lot of feelings of rejection, failure, all the things that go with that. And even so, God is there with us, and He's going to reshape our lives. And, I often say, Jesus is the only one who made plan A. For the rest of us, He turns our B plan and C plan into His A plan. See, He's a tremendously redemptive God. And no matter how bad you blow it, no matter what happen to you, there's always the cross that can redeem something. So I'd encourage any of you who've gone some of those major failures to know that it's not over, you know. God will use that failure. The biggest thing is that we need to fail forward, right? And learn from it. Someone else.
What do you see for your legacy? What is your vision for the future?
Oh, what I see for my legacy in the future. I just, I actually, a year ago, I thought I thought I was done. I really, I had not written any more books. I didn't want to do any conferences. I was in a season of isolation again. And it was only as a result of connecting with a couple in their late 30s who had a vision for the reemerging the 7 Mountain Strategy. And something triggered in me and said, okay, it's time to get back in the game. And so I don't know what this next season's going to be, but I'm just trying to take it a day at a time, and as God shows us. And that's all any of us can do, isn't it? Taking one day at a time. Lord, what would you have of me today? And you give me the vision, and you show me the strategy, and I'll be obedient. I think that's all any of us can ask. Someone else? Yes, sir.
Executives, what do you see as the number one shortcoming?
As I coach executives, what do I see the greatest
Frequent occurring shortcoming.
Well, I think that, I was asked several years ago, back in the 90s, when the whole Faith at Work initiative was really coming to the public eye. And I was interviewed by the New York Times for an article they were doing in the New York Times. It was going to be an insert in the Sunday paper. And it was about a Christian in the marketplace, and it was very unusual for them to do something like that. But anyway, they interviewed me 3 times. And on the 3rd time, they came back and said, so we have this story ready to run, but some of our employees are asking us, what is the difference between a Christian in the marketplace and a non-Christian? And I thought, well, that's a really good question. And so I said, well, I think there's 4 things. The first thing is excellence. God calls us to do our work with excellence. It says in Daniel chapter 1, it says, Daniel and his 3 friends did their work 10 times better than anyone else. The second thing is with integrity, that we're to do our work and calling with integrity. Psalm 51, after David fails in his relationship with Bathsheba, and he loses his son as judgment from God. And one of the phrases he uses in there is that he desires truth in the inward parts. That means that we're the same person outside as we are at home. We're people of integrity. The third one is being people, a servant leader. Jesus said, if you want to be great among them, you must be a servant of all. It's interesting. I always look at things differently sometimes, and I think about, when Jesus came to earth, have you ever thought about the fact that the first miracle he did was turning water into wine? I mean, just think of the problem with Baptists he's going to have with that right off the bat. I mean, that's a PR nightmare. He's claiming to be God, and he's turning water into wine. I just think that way sometimes. But it was the servants who saw the miracle. It wasn't the guest. They experienced it, but it was the servants who were up close to see that. So if you're a servant, you have the opportunity to see the activity of God. Then the fourth one is miracles. In Acts chapter 5, it says, the apostles performed many miraculous signs in the public colonnade where the people could see them. It wasn't in the synagogue. Jesus never took anybody to the synagogue to get healed. He never really ministered in the synagogue, other than reading the Word of God. He did it in the marketplace. And I'll leave this last thing with you. When God came to Moses through the burning bush, he said, Moses, take off your shoes, for this is holy ground. And so he took off his shoes. Now, why was it holy ground? It was because the presence of God was there. It was in a dusty area where all the sheep were, but he's saying this is holy ground. So that's principle number one. Your workplace should be holy ground because you're bringing the presence of God there. Second, he said, now Moses, what's that in your hand? Of course, he knew what it was, but he wanted Moses to have a conversation with him. He said, well, it's my staff, Lord. And he said, now put it down on the ground. And when he put it down on the ground, it turned into a snake. And then God says, now pick it up by the tail. Now that was a prophetic illustration of having authority over the serpent. But also what happened in that discourse was, it says that he actually became the staff of God. It was no longer Moses' staff. And he said, now I'm going to perform miracles through that staff. And I believe that's what God's called you and I to do, is to use our staff, our vocations, to really express the life of God in that to other people. Thank you. Dwight?